at Majors and Quinn Booksellers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thanks for tuning in today for another virtual author event. Today we're very pleased to have a special young adult novel event for you. And so we are going to have Hannah Abigail Clarke presenting their novel, The Scapegracers, which is just perfect for as we head into spooky season. The leaves are turning, it's fall. It's a great story about some witchy teens. And they're going to be in conversation with Naomi Kritzer, who you may know has done events with us in the past, author of Catfishing on Catnet, and a local friend of ours. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here. And first, we're going to hear a little bit from the Scapegracers. And if you have any questions or comments throughout the event, please type them in the comments on Facebook or YouTube. We will see them, and we will take audience questions towards the end. So if you think of a question at any point, write them in there. Thank you so much, and take it away, Hannah.
Alrighty, so I'm going to be reading from the 4th chapter and envisioning the other timeline where movie theaters still exist. All you need to know for the context of the scene is that there are 4 teenagers who are newly minted friends, still figuring out what that looks like for them, and they're going to have some fun for the first time. There were 3 theaters within a reasonable drive from Sycamore Gorge. 2 of them were part of huge chain corporations. Their tickets were expensive and the snacks were subpar. No one went to either. Instead, the dive of choice was the Gorge's own dilapidated Queen's Cinema. It ought to be condemned. It was a crumbling, ramshackle slot at the end of Main Street, splattered with spray paint and dripping hairy vines, and the second light of E and Queens had been broken for the past 3 years. A group of cardinals had nested inside it. Through the industrial doors, the inside smelled like pickle brine and caramel. Outdated movie posters sat crooked and warped behind cracked glass cases, and seedy pop music mixed with the techno jingle of arcade games. The staff wasn't paid enough to give a damn about mopping up the slushy splatters or the crushed popcorn, so every step on the bowling alley carpet crunched up underfoot. I am such a sucker for Queen's Cinema. The 4 of us stood between the stained red stanchions and passed a bottle of Coke back and forth. I was still in the velvet dress, but it felt a little less like wearing nothing now that I was back in my leather jacket. The jacket put a barrier between my velvety self and the sharp, cold world. The Coke tasted flat, and I drank it anyway. We meandered a little farther down the line, and I let myself tune back into the conversation. Daisy was explaining the reportedly god-shattering hookup she'd had in the single-stall bathroom around the back. I had to lather myself with rubbing alcohol afterward, she said smoothly, but it was completely worth it. You're a public menace, Jing said. It sounded bizarrely like praise. 4 tickets to see the cheesy horror movie. Yates bounced on her toes, smoothed her hands against the ticket counter, and smiled up at the employee with the radiance of 20,000 cherubim. The employee behind the ticket counter yawned. Said employee was the poster child for mono symptoms or maybe cocaine addiction. It was hard to tell in this town. Together or separate, said dark under-eye circles girl. Her voice was completely devoid of inflection. I thought she might croak as soon as we looked away. Her name tag might have said Kaylee or Bailey or Shaylee, something like that, but I didn't pay too much attention. Together, said Daisy as she slapped down her credit card. I opened my mouth to protest, but Jing shot me a look. IDs, said the UC girl. We're supposed to ID folks for R-rated movies. I reached for my wallet, but Jing waved a hand at me. She looked up at the UC girl and cocked a brow. Do you care? That's a good point, said the UC girl. Her eyes rolled up in her head. Last theater to the left. Enjoy your film. The 4 of us ambled onward toward the snack line, which was where most people seemed to be haphazardly slapped together. They held processed snack food in their claws. Someone in line was vaping, and their breath bleached the air above them like smokestack exhaust. Jing breathed a comment about losers that I didn't quite catch. I saw a barrage of leather jackets, vineyard vines, tattered jeans. A trio of older women primed with matching coach bags and feathered bobs were interrogating a second DUC girl about whether or not popcorn was gluten-free. A kid bawled at their feet. Yates tossed her arm around my shoulders. Daisy knelt beside the candy rack and ogled at the baggies like senior boys ogle freshman girls. Her tongue dipped out of the corner of her mouth. She reached her hands into the racks and dragged her fingertips across the surface of every single package, touching everything, coffin nails warping the plastic wrap as she dragged them along. It was a motion I associated with selecting tarot cards, but on Daisy, the typical tarot introspection was replaced with something ravenous and canine. She plucked 3 boxes from the back of each stack, sprang upright, and tucked them against her ribs. It was more candy than we could possibly eat. Her eyes burned bright. "Don't worry, guys," she said. "I picked the best ones." "I can believe it," said Jane. I could believe it too. It was the rest of this whole going to a place I like with people who like me bit that I was having trouble with. Jing shoulder checked her way through a group of jock types to the front of the line. "Extra large popcorn and extra large slushy, please. White cherry, no butter on the popcorn." She paused, rolled her eyes toward me. "You don't like butter on your popcorn, do you?" All popcorn is good popcorn. Do what you will," I said. I shoved my hands in my pockets. She pursed her lips. I took that as affirmation. The bag of popcorn was roughly the size of Jing's torso. Yates reached inside it, hooked a golden fistful between her fingers, and tossed it between her teeth with an audible crunch. Daisy did the same, which was impressive considering how constricted her arms were by the candy she was carrying. I let my hand stay put. Daisy shifted forward, pulling out her not credit card again, but instead a fistful of $20 bills, looking as cool as if she was tucking said 20s into a stripper's G-string. I offhandedly assumed that those 20s covered Jing's slushy and her popcorn. If they didn't, then Jing's snacks were technically stolen. Not that DUC girls seemed to give even a single fuck about that. We took our snacks and hauled them down the hallway to the left. We passed an animated reimagining/slaughtering of some 80s cartoon and the fourth sequel to an action series that I didn't care about. After that, there was a shitty-looking spy movie, a rom-com that was miasmic even to walk by, an Oscar-baiting bore fest. Our movie, naturally, was in the backmost projector room. Ghastly. The dripping letters on the poster taped above the door were bubblegum pink and featured an ambiguous white boy with a gag in his teeth. The trailers were already rolling inside. Daisy cut to the front of the pack and brought us deeper and deeper into the belly of the theater. We sat on one of the first rows, dead center in the buttery darkness. Movie-going for me had historically been my dad's and me toward the back of the latest sci-fi matinee. Sitting in the front felt different on my skin. It felt vaguely like spellcasting, too loud, too hot, as hyper as an intravenous caffeine drip. The lights dropped and the screen lit up, and they say there's no such thing as love at first sight. Cue the muffled screaming. The camera swept over the electric blue eyes and panned outward to reveal the boy from the poster, an overly handsome blonde with a ribbon in his teeth. He thrashed in his leather jacket, eyes whirling around and around in their sockets. The zipped eyes didn't snap. He tried to heave himself upright, but the minty turf was slick. He slipped, fell on his knee. One of the football floodlights flicked on, and long shadows fell across him. His rabbit eyes popped wide. A group of countless girls in hooded pastel robes stood around him in a circle, and the leader, marked by her distinctive Barbie pink cloak, took a step toward him. She withdrew a mean pair of scissors from her sleeve, and the hooded figures clapped, jeered, pulled out their iPhones, and hit record. "The sisterhood has identified you as a cheating asshole," said the leader girl. She brandished the scissors like an athame. "So, die." The scissors flew across the jock's throat, and red splashed the screen. Ghastly. Yates smothered a laugh with her hand, and Jing punched her in the shoulder. The camera panned over main character, a horrifyingly generic new girl who was not like those other slutty girls. She naturally didn't have any friends, because that's what happens to people who act like condescending pricks to everyone who approaches them, so logically she set her heart on befriending a conventionally attractive jock boy for some reason. Unfortunately for her, Jock Boy was revealed to be the newest boyfriend of Bitchy Cheerleader, the school's uncontested tyrant who ran the student body like some sort of 40s mafioso. Bitchy Cheerleader was, from my perspective, ridiculously hot and incredibly cool. Despite his relationship with Bitchy Cheerleader, Jock Boy flirted with main character, and the two of them acquired some sort of instant magic love connection despite having zero chemistry. I wasn't sure if that was a legit thing with heterosexual kids, but it wasn't any more convincing in this movie than it had been in any other Hollywood movie made prior to this one. Main character and Jock Boy nearly screw in the passenger seat of his Italian car. Of course, they don't commit the deed, because main character feels the need to remind him and the audience that she's not like those other sluts. It broke Jock Boy's heart. He called Bitchy Cheerleader to voice his doubts about their relationship, outright admitting to cheating in the process, an admission which spelled out his obvious and much deserved demise. Bitchy Cheerleader took it upon herself to correct the whole situation. She invited main character to a party of hers, which main character attended in hopes of flirting with Jockboy some more. But when main character arrived at the ritzy Victorian mansion she'd been directed to, she didn't arrive at a party. Instead, Bitchy Cheerleader and all her friends stood waiting. They donned their pastel robes. They all smiled at her. They offered her a pink robe of her very own. "Join the sisterhood," said Bitchy Cheerleader. She handed over the scissors. "We used to make valentines with these. Stupid gifts for stupid boys who use us, screw us, leave us. Now we use them for better things. I know you cheated with him, but I will forgive you if you kill him for us. For yourself. For the sisterhood. We don't need boys like him. They're better off dead." Main character hesitantly accepted the scissors. She used them to slash at Bitchy Cheerleader's face. The finale of the movie was a tempest of jump scares and bloodbaths, but it was ultimately uninspiring as main character found obviously hidden Jockboy, who had been tied up and left on Bitchy Cheerleader's bed. The camera shook as main character cut off his zip ties and led him downstairs, where a pissed off group of hooded girls lay in wait. They ran, hid, screamed too loudly. They both miraculously made it out alive. A few of the sisters didn't. Bitchy Cheerleader stared down the camera and vowed revenge. Credits rolled, lights went up. The four of us climbed unceremoniously to our feet. And then things go wrong. But, oh boy, would I love to be in a movie theater again.
So, all right. Yeah, I miss movie theaters. A lot, and I love the movie theater you describe. It sounds really lovely. It's like the the non-chain, run by apathetic teenagers kind of.
Yeah, like the weird little dives that still exist somehow in the middle of nowhere.
One of the things I really loved in this book were some of the places. I really adored. Is it pronounced Delacroix House?
I think it's in my mind it's Delacroix.
Delacroix House. Okay, I
don't think Sideways can say that.
My French is not good. Sideways' French is probably better than mine. Did you draw on anything in real life for any of the cool spots in your book, or were they all like things that auto exist even if they don't?
I mean, while there isn't a witch headquarters in the middle of like the Rust Belt that I know of, there are plenty of very weird, cool little stores and gathering spots in the middle of nowhere that crop up and seem to like self-propagate even without business. Like a little bit of it was somewhere in Southern Ohio. I couldn't tell you which town right now. There's a haunted hotel called the Golden Lamb.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and like a little bit of that was the Delacroix house, but also I feel like I've just been in so many unusual little spaces that inexplicably seem to like appear from nowhere in otherwise little populated areas. So,
all right. So let's talk about girl friendship tropes, because you spend a lot of time in this book subverting them. There's this expectation in like a lot of honed from years of movies and books about popular girl cliques that the popular girls will use you and then reject/abuse you. And instead here we get like, you're ours now and we're keeping you. And it was unexpected and delightful. And I would love to hear you talk some about your take on those tropes and like where you were, what you were aiming at with subversion.
Yeah, so I really love the archetype of the mean girl clique because I love like all of the camp that goes with it. I feel like mean girl clique movies tend to have really weird stylized dialogue and hyper feminine fashion that doesn't show up in real life, which is exciting. Like a lot of them seem to belong to their own weird little genre niche, but they're always abusive to like the other girls in the group and everyone around them, and they fall apart usually as like the climax of the film. Like and Heather's, they all die basically. In Jawbreaker, everything about Jawbreaker is already a mess from the get-go, but it does not last in Jawbreaker. Mean Girls, they fall apart, and that's supposed to be a good thing. A lot of these movies have like a violent falling apart. Like the bus in Mean Girls is funny, except also like she could have died, right? Heather's, they literally all are murdered.
Yeah.
Like The Craft, which is the kind of anti Mean Girls Clique movie, they still fall apart. Like they still can't be in solidarity with each other. They still can't look out for each other. And I'm really interested as a young queer person in found family and in making really, really tightly knit little community units. And I think that girls who are like hyper feminine and therefore are like the other in young adult fiction, and are mean and scary because of that, have a lot to talk about with girls who are too masculine to be like the not like other girls trope proper. And I'm kind of tired of like cutthroat girl rivalries that are motivated by nothing other than girls who are competitive. I like friendship.
I read a really interesting, I don't know if you ever watched Firefly, but I saw a really interesting analysis once of like the scene where Kaylee is at the shindig and like everyone gets together to snub her, and somebody was like, no, she's a stranger. She's interesting. Everyone's going to want to talk to her. And it would have been great to see, a scene where she's hanging out with the girls instead of being not like other girls. But of course, that's what you get when stuff is made by people who fundamentally hate women.
Yep.
So spinning off from there, Yates has this great line on page 108 about teenage girls specifically, where she says, everyone hates teenage girls. They hate our bodies and hate us if we want to change them. They hate the things we're supposed to like, but hate it when we like other things even more, because that means we're ruining their things. We're somehow this great corrupting influence, even though we've barely got legal agency of our own. I love that line. And I thought it sort of both in terms of how it connected to things I've seen over the years with anything that gets really popular among teenage girls. Like, I was not a huge fan of Twilight, but like the utter contempt people would heap on it at the drop of a hat was kind of amazing, because like it's not like there weren't plenty of things that teenage boys like that were just as brainless, I also liked how this kind of tackles the not like other girls trope. And you want to talk at all about how, like, your thoughts on this, or how the book tackled either of these?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like part of the reason why we see the Mean Girls clique so often is because like teenage girls, it allows you to both desire teenage girls and hate them at the same time. Like that's the structure of those movies, right? Like you look at the mean, hot, evil bitches, and you are encouraged to both like gaze at them and think that they're funny and cool, but also like cheer on their demise and their like the process of alienating them from their friends. I don't know, like there's much to be said structurally about the desire for young women and also the hatred of young women that a lot of people seem to feel in equal parts all of the time, which is why the not like other girls trope is there, right? Because it's your way of having a character who I feel like tends to usually be like an audience avatar sometimes. Like it's a way of saying that you have disavowed the kinds of femininity that are hateable,
Right.
because you also hate them, but you're still feminine enough that people don't think you're the other kind of girl you can be, which is to say like a really queer girl. Like I would expect with all of the not like other girls characters for there to be a bunch of like butches running around who are not like other girls because they're not feminine, right?
Yeah.
And we don't have any, like, there are very, very few butch protagonists
Yeah.
in fiction, like, writ large.
Yeah.
So it was important to me writing this book that we both have teenage girls who are aware of their own position as mean girls, like they know, and they
Mhm.
know how people receive them, and they use that to navigate their social spaces. And then Sideways knows she's not like other girls, but she knows that because she's like masculine
Yeah.
and very queer, which does separate her from traditional girlhood and femininity in a pretty marked way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. That the not like other girls trope. It depends on the girl being straight
Hmm.
and cis, and she has to, she has to be like, she has to be, rejecting femininity, but only up to a point, and then past that point, it's suddenly no longer okay. There's this tiny band where it's acceptable. I'm trying to figure out where the camera is. Tiny little band where it's like you can be just not like other girls enough to be acceptable to the boys, but not so much that like you would be competing with them or just not interested in them at all.
Hmm. Yeah, and I feel like it leaves out a lot of narrative potential because there are lots and lots of characters who exist in this very narrow landing strip, and there are huge spans of ways girls can be and ways that femininity and like uh, we might think of like a queer masculinity or butchness might exist in girl characters that we just don't touch on. And I'm excited for more books to veer wildly off the track that has been predetermined.
Yes. Yeah. So when does this have a sequel coming out? And when is that? Is that coming out in a year?
Yeah, I believe it's coming out next summer.
Next summer. Okay.
Yeah, it's
And is it
called
planned? Oh, what's it called?
it's called The Scratch Daughters.
Okay. And what's is it planned as a trilogy, or is this open, or?
So it was planned as a trilogy loosely upon the time of me writing the first book. But I also, I wrote this when I was 19, and I was aware of the fact that people often write lots and lots of manuscripts before one gains traction,
Mhm.
and sometimes even more than that before one sells, once you have representation. Um, so I didn't have concrete plans to write the next two
Mm.
because like it was always only going to be I'll write the next two if this is a project that winds up moving forward.
Mhm.
Um, and it wound up moving forward, which meant that right around the time we signed, I very quickly conceived of the plot of the next two books to hand
Yeah.
them to my now editor. Um, yeah, so now it is a planned trilogy, but it
Okay.
initially was kind of ambiguous.
So I would love to hear some about writing young adult fiction as an actual young adult. So you were like what? How old were you when you started writing, and how did you get started as a writer?
Mm. I mean, the first time I wrote a manuscript length original project, I was 16. And I wrote it, looking back, like, I don't think that project will ever, in any of its iterations, see the light of day. Um, but I wrote it because I was, as many queer 16-year-olds are, kind of unwell and kind of in a place of existential unsurety. And I was reading an assigned book for class, and a passage like made me feel again for the first time. And it's like, oh, I can do this. And like language lets you feel again. And so I started writing a lot, and I haven't stopped.
So, like, what were some of your influences as you were writing? Like, what were the books you were reading as a teenager and loving and telling everyone around you to read?
Ah, as a teenager, I was a very big fan of Cassandra Clare.
Okay,
Uh,
sure.
like I cosplayed Jace a lot with my girlfriends, cosplaying Clary. It was a whole thing.
Oh, cool.
It was very cute. We were very cute.
Mm.
I was really into Jeremy. which is a contemporary book about cheerleaders. I was really into like Oscar Wilde. I was very into Shakespeare. I had only moved like slightly past books that had been handed to me by teachers or books that were popular enough that in a town without an independent bookseller, I could hear about them.
Yeah.
So my taste was, I think there actually were more books where I could have seen myself out at the time, but I didn't know about them because I didn't have a cool indie to like hand me what I needed, which is a shame. I what else was it? The book that made me want to write was actually The Woman Warrior.
Oh yeah, I love her. Actually, I loved it as a teenager, and she wasn't. That was not this Maxine Hahn Kingston, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she wasn't writing it for teenagers, but I adored it as a teenager, and like identified really strongly with the protagonist, despite living an incredibly different life.
Yeah, like the scene where the ghost sits on her mother's chest.
Mm-hmm.
Was like, oh, that's what my mental illness feels like. I now have metaphors to scaffold my world with.
Yeah.
And even though that book isn't speculative fiction, like that scene is very spec-fic.
It isn't, but it kind of is. I mean, it's a non. Be interesting to make a list of books that are technically not spec fic, but like that really strongly tend to work really well for spec fic readers. Yeah, I loved. Okay, so the thing about that book that really spoke to me was she tells you the story that's like story of a girl in China running away and becoming a warrior and like serving the army for years and years and years and like it's like really it's a really long section of the book and then it switches abruptly back to her real life and her mom yelling at her for getting bad grades or something like that. And like that spoke to me so strongly because I lived this really, extensive fantasy life and then also had a real life that was forever disappointing to me, so yeah. So what are you saying?
I was going to say that Sailor Moon definitely is implicitly in everything I will ever write because I watched Sailor Moon when I was a toddler. So it is part of it is a lens through which I will view all other media. Omnipresent.
Sure. So as a very young person who was writing YA, do you feel like you have a stronger sense of what teenagers are like since you were writing as a teenager? Or did you feel like I would know what teenagers were like if I were a normal teenager, but I'm not, so I don't,
I think I would have had a really hard time writing a straight teenager.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like, I mean, particularly with my context, like I was a queer teenager who was living in like Ohio farm country. And it was made very clear to me that I was an outlier. So I think particularly when I was younger, I had a very hard time conceptualizing or like garnering the willingness to conceptualize like a straight girl's point of view. Now, I don't know if I would write a straight protagonist now, but I think now I wouldn't have the same like mental block as I did then. It is funny when people like talk about the teen dialogue. I don't know if it's stilted or not. This is just how I spoke when I was 19. So
yeah,
it could be that I was a stilted 19-year-old. That is fully possible. But
I had this conversation with my writers group years and years ago. There was somebody who had a character who everyone complained didn't talk like a real kid. And like the next night I went out to dinner with my family and my older kid, who was at the time 7, on our way back to the car says, "This walk is so tiresome. Why didn't you park closer?" And I looked at it, was like, real kids don't talk like you, Molly. It's just like people talk. Yeah, there's huge variety in how people sound. Okay, let's see. All right. I was going to bring up this passage on page 186. Daisy is talking. And she says, now I have to fucking kill those assholes. Boys don't touch my girls. I swear to God. I can be a fucking monster when I want to be. Not good at a whole lot, but I'm spectacular at terrorizing people until they've literally lost it. So one of the things I was really intrigued by in this book is how much of the violence, and by violence I'm including the curses, because they are definitely an act of violence in the context of the book.
Yeah.
It is heavily, if not entirely, about getting back at men who are seen as impervious. They are not subject to consequences in ordinary life, but they are subject to consequences in this book. Is that something you'd be interested in talking about for a minute or two?
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like this is a dangerous spoiler. So the boys who, with one exception, like who are the subject of curses in this book, are the sons of like a sheriff. Like they are like structurally, I can't fathom the legal system ever getting them in trouble for anything short of something like spectacularly harmful. I mean, we know that the legal system punishes some people more than others, shall we say. I put up no illusions about not being a an aspiring police abolitionist, but the boys who do harm to people in this book are all wealthy cis white boys who I think would be very unlikely to ever face harm for the kinds of actions that they do. And the Chet hex that Scapegracers throw around is, I mean, we might say that it's impulsive or that it's rash or that it's too much. All of those things could be true, but it's designed to be preventative, right? Like the Chet hex doesn't hurt you in the moment. The Chet hex hurts you if you contemplate doing harm to people, and then you're in like physical agony for a while. Because I think, at least among the Scapegracers, there is a perception that they are the only people they have, and that there is no superstructure here to save them if they get hurt or if somebody wants to harm them. And the people who want to harm them are people with substantial structural power over them. So, yeah, like the violence, the girls are subjected to different kinds of violence in this book, and they respond in turn. There's not a lot of forgiving and forgetting with these characters. And yeah, like I just, maybe it was wish fulfillment for 19-year-old me to a certain extent. I was certainly not somebody who punched back. So, you know.
Yeah, I thought a lot about sort of the wish fulfillment that I've been craving in recent years, and that sort of fantasy of being able to, that fantasy of retribution is really powerful right now, in particular, I think.
Yeah. And it's like, I don't think Chet hexes would make structural change ever. But I think for scared teenagers, it is, yeah.
Reminded me a little of the Carrie Underwood song about messing up the guy's car after he cheated on her. A friend of mine who works as a defense lawyer was like, Carrie, don't carve your name. That's evidence that can be used against you. And I was like, part of what makes that song so powerful is that it is about like being so angry you don't even care. Like the video shows her name. Like she really, literally. But anyway. Okay. One of the things I was thinking about, like in the last day or two, are the ways in which Mr. Scratch, not to get too far into spoiler territory, but there's a lot of ways in which Mr. Scratch is parallel to Sideways. They were both sort of orphaned. They were literally or figuratively orphaned. and then viewed by authority figures as just too damaged, and then adopted. And is that a parallel that you put in intentionally, or is it just one of those like sort of accidental moments of genius?
I mean, I wanted. So I'm really interested in trauma narratives, and they are both people who've had different kinds of, but overlapping sorts of trauma. And I wanted, like, Mr. Scratch is kind of what would happen if Sideways wasn't saved when she was. Like, Sideways was in the foster care system for like a few months, and it was a scary and damaging time of her life. And she was mourning and felt helpless and confused and scared. But she was accepted very warmly into her adoptive household, which is like a super nurturing, supportive environment
They're
for her.
so lovely. I love her dad so much.
Her dads are really, they make me very happy. But like Scratch, it's been a very long time. Like Scratch has been, when he was deemed dangerous, he was completely isolated for decades by people who supposedly like could have helped him, right? Like he was not imprisoned by villains. He was contained by other witches, right? So in a certain extent, while I was trying to play with similar architectures of their lives, I think Scratch is kind of what happens if you let that fester.
Right. What did you draw on when you were creating the witchcraft in the book?
Part of it was actual practice from myself and other practitioners I know. Like sigil work is a very much like a real part of practice that is done in a lot of different witchcraft circles. Sigils are all over the place. Like incantations for grounding show up all over the place, and are kind of an ancient and well-known means of getting magic done. Like togetherness, needing to be with other people, pretty old school. But I knew I wanted to exaggerate some of what that looked like, and I knew that I wanted it to be more body centered than a lot of the magic I was reading at the time. Like I feel as though a lot of magic systems establish magic as something like a science, like it's a phenomena that can be observed and with precision can be manipulated to the wielder's desire, and it's dangerous and there might be consequences, but it's like when you get down to it, it's a natural phenomena, which is cool, and I like a lot of those stories, but it also lets you make magic into this cerebral thing with rules that you can intellectualize away. And Sideways is driven enough by her own central traumas that she can't intellectualize and rationalize away. That it felt like a prudent thing to put magic in her body and to make it like a sometimes overwhelming, sometimes painful effect of her being a corporeal being who is moving through the world, which is where I come up with like soul as organ instead of soul as ephemeral substance.
Yeah. Let's see. What are you reading these days?
What am I reading? Okay, so I've been proselytizing Catherine House, which is by Elizabeth Thomas. It's fantastic. I love it a lot, a lot, a lot. I really enjoy Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. Alexis is great, and that book is the anti-state witchy book that I wanted it to be. I thought Harrow the Ninth was phenomenal. Also, Harrow the Ninth, fantastic trauma narrative. Let's see, what else have I been reading? I'm currently in the process of starting Blessed Monsters by Emily A. Duncan, which is the third book. It'll be coming out next year in Something Dark and Holy, which is their trilogy. Yeah, like, lots of cool stuff. Lots of cool stuff to be read.
I am running low on prepared questions, and I'm wondering if the audience has anything they would like to ask. If so, they could type it in their in the feed, and I should see it in the little bar in the corner. And
what have you been reading?
What have I been reading?
I came on to ask
that. Let's see. Well, The Scapegracers is the most recent book I've read. Before that, I haven't finished it yet, but I was working on a book called The Mathematician's Shiva, which is just this very random novel about the death of an immigrant mathematician. But it's like the Jewish community in my hometown, and I'm like, I totally wanna read it for the maths and stuff. And then what else have I been reading lately? Way too much Twitter.
Yeah.
Doom scrolling like you wouldn't believe.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Naomi, do you want to tell us a little bit, because the sequel to Catnet is coming out sometime?
Should be. It's scheduled to come out next April.
Okay, so
yeah.
Do you want to give us a brief summary of, like, what was catfishing on Catnet, and then what's happening in that next one?
Sure. Catfishing on Catnet is about a teenage girl who is lives a lot of her life online, like all her friendships are online on the social network Catnet, because her mother moves her constantly. And Catnet is run, maintained, and moderated by an artificial intelligence that is in kind of masquerading as a whole bunch of different people. But Steph finds out that it's an AI, and also, like, her father starts to catch up with them, and she has to flee with the help of both real world friends and online friends. And then also winds up having to rescue the AI from its creator. So then in Chaos on Catnet, there's a hint at the end of Catfishing that there's a second AI out there. And Chaos on Catnet, that AI shows up, and it is also running a whole series of social networks / games that it is using to manipulate people. And it is a lot less invested in overall well-being of individual people than the original AI is. And mayhem ensues.
Yes.
Mostly in Minneapolis. Unlike the first one, which is set in a small town in Wisconsin that I definitely made up from whole cloth and did not base on an existing small town in more or less that location. A couple of people have emailed me and been like, "Is it Neilsville?" So basically Neilsville.
Cat's out of the bag. Yeah, well, great. We will be looking out for that one as well. We have a question here from Judy. I noted that you said, Hannah, you'd read a lot of Shakespeare when you were younger. Do any of the themes of his work make their way into your writing? Has that boiled in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think weirdly more than any themes, I was the kind of nerdy kid who went to Shakespeare classes on the weekends, every weekend for 2 years. And in those classes, there was a lot of just talk of diction and lots of reading aloud and over enunciating to see what different kinds of syllable pairings do for your mood and do to your body. So I think the practice of reading Shakespeare itself informed the work a lot, particularly with all of Sideways' spellcasting scenes. However, Sideways is the drama kid. Specifically, she's a crew person, but she was the understudy for Lady Mac in her school's production of Mac. So, like, the unsex me speech definitely was part of my initial figuring of what speeches that do magic look like, because the unsex me speech is very much about Lady Mac's body and wanting to change Lady Mac's body and her weird gender feelings about her body that she thinks she needs to tap into to do magic. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that was a great answer. All right, let's see. Do you have any more questions, Naomi, from your list?
I think I hit everything I had written down. Yeah. Oh, you know what? There was one other question I was going to ask. Which is, I made a note. Have you been following the conversation about the movie Cordelia on Twitter? There is this poster for it, this publicity photo that shows a woman pushing a man up against a wall from behind and sort of like nibbling on his neck. And like everyone I know, and it includes myself, saw that and thought it was like a historical costume drama.
It was like
where the woman, what?
I said it was really sexy. Like it was like
really sexy, and also his collar is just, it looks like one of those high Victorian collars, and when you look closer, you realize no, it's totally just a shirt. But it was something about angles and colors, and like it's apparently a horror movie. And I just, yeah, have you been following that? Because I was thinking about that when you were reading your bit about the horror movie, and like, you know, like why is like female sexuality the scariest thing apparently to do?
I mean, like, so I'm a huge horror movie buff, and I feel like female sexuality is almost always, if there's a woman in a horror movie who's an antagonist, like her sexuality is the thing that is scary. However, that was certainly a moment of me like looking at a poster and realizing that I lived in an entirely different universe than straight men, even though we both like women. It's like, wow, like, is intimacy really the scariest thing for you? I'm so sorry. It's really sad. Yeah. So other than like a moment of pitying heterosexual men, I don't know. Like, it seems like a curious way to angle your horror movie, just to see the like soft toned intimacy on a poster.
Yeah, well, I think too that like the most recent thing that I saw Johnny Flynn in was Emma, and he was very good as Mr. Knightley. And so like I think that also it was like, oh, historical, here we go, period piece, you got this. And then looking into it, the trailer, I was like, wait. We have a question here from Sneha. What thing that you're really into talking about or researching would you love to include in a book that you haven't yet had the opportunity to use? Let's hear from both of you on this one.
Yeah. So I'm weirdly a huge alchemy nerd. Like alchemy, like alchemical. Like I'm really into. Like there are a list of names of the first matter, like the material from which everything is supposedly, according to alchemy, derived. And it just, like alchemists took themselves so seriously, and it was like a bunch of weird, rich, like particularly in Europe, because there were other, like a lot of alchemy was like stolen from Middle Eastern practice, but like European alchemists were just a bunch of like weirdos with direct state power. Like John Dee, Elizabeth I's tutor, was an alchemist. So I don't know, like at some point I want to do something really like blasphemous and unorthodox with alchemy that is very wrong and not at all the point that anyone who ever was into it would ever want me to do. Yeah.
I find corvids, crows, really, really interesting and cool. And there's this short story I've been trying to write about somebody who can like understand what they're singing. And I can't get the story to work, but I really want to get that story to work because I really want to have a story about how cool corvids are.
So cool.
Nice. Here's one from Liz. You both talked about fictionalizing or amalgamating small towns in your work. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the pros and cons of rooting something in a real place versus, say, incurring the wrath of people who reside there.
So Part of why I did not make it Neilsville, but renamed it and then just use Neilsville is I wanted a town. Anytime I was like, would a town this small have like a Walmart? Where would the nearest Walmart be? I wanted to be able to look it up. But at the same time, I didn't want people who are actually from the town like emailing me and saying like, well, they would have just shopped at like Joe's Everything Mart, or whatever, which is literally, like I mentioned, I was reading a book set in Madison where I grew up. There's a bit where like it talks about like the drugstore they go to. And I'm like, they're 2 blocks from the drugstore. I know this part of town well enough that I knew exactly where the nearest drugstore was, and they're not going there. They're like, oh no, we have to go to this other place. And I'm like, you're 2 blocks from Newhousers, come on. So that's the problem is that if it's a real town and it's not your real town, you will always have mistakes like that. And people will be, mildly irritated. I don't know if it's usually wrath, but at least mildly irritated. So
the town I was writing about is close enough to the town I came of age in and also surrounding towns that I probably could have, like if I hadn't wanted to make up stores, like the antique shop is not a real antique shop. And the Delclaw house like does not exist in real life, unfortunately. But the problem is the town is small enough that a lot of people know me. Like my mom works at my mom sells incense at like the local head shop, and so now that head shop sells the Scapegracers.
Yeah.
It's just you can buy your incense and your pipes here, but also this book. And if it had been, like particularly because I'm writing about a young queer person, I think I would have never been spared accusations that it was autobiographical, which it's not. My mother is alive and well and has never been hit by a train, among other things about Sideways' life. So I think part of it was just like separating Sideways meaningfully from myself by putting her not in Oxford, Ohio.
Yeah.
I was really curious. My mother both of my parents actually grew up in Ohio. My mother in Springfield and my father in Dayton. So I've actually spent a huge amount of time in Ohio because it was where both my grandparents lived. It's where I had my appendix out at 15 because I got sick when we were visiting my grandparents. Yeah. My mom hated Springfield so much. She told me when I was a teenager that she had still fantasized about like having enough money to pay the city to let her bulldoze the high school. That was when she was in her 30s or 40s.
Wow.
Yeah.
I like that energy.
Yeah. My mom was really awesome, honestly.
The vibe.
All right. Well, that was a really good question. And the answer of like it being a way to, one of the ways you can use to pull it away from, this is not autobiographical, because readers really will. They'll go there, especially with work by women or people. It's like they often are like, but this must be you just as a fake person. And you're like, I don't. Does it?
More than one lesbian can exist. There can be many of us.
Yes. Wild.
We're not the Slayer. Like, we're not the situation.
Absolutely. So thank you both. I think we've gotten through the questions. Thank you everyone who was watching. And everyone who is watching, please don't forget to check out majorsandquinn.com where you can get your copy of the Scapegracers. Or you could also swing by. Majors and Quinn is actually open to browsing. A limited number of people in the store at once. Bring your mask, but we are open noon to 7 every day. And we would love to see you if you're in the Twin Cities area. So thank you again to both of our authors for this wonderful conversation. Love talking about young adult fiction and the writing process, and it is just very exciting to have you both here. And the Scapegracers is a really awesome and fun book, so you should buy it for yourself, buy it for a reader you know. And hopefully we can speak to both of you for the second installment of both of your books. 2021, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
You too.